At the millionaire's wedding, a mother of triplets stormed into the church, seized the microphone, and shocked every guest with her words. Maria ascended the mansion's staircase with a heavy heart, feeling a wave of dread grow stronger with each step. Carl had summoned her to his room, but his behavior had recently turned cold, almost calculated, as if he were preparing to end things for good. She had worked here for years, and the bond they'd shared in secret now felt distant and fading. There was a weight in the air around her, something unspoken, but undeniably there. Standing in front of the door, Maria paused, hesitating. She always knocked twice, a small unspoken ritual that once brought them closer. But tonight, even that familiar action felt uncertain. What's wrong with him? Why has he become so remote? She wondered, trying to steady her nerves. At last, she knocked, and his voice replied, cold, distant. "Come in." Taking a deep breath, Maria opened the door and entered. Carl stood with his back turned, gazing out the window at the mansion's sprawling gardens. His posture was tense, and the silence in the room pressed down on her, almost suffocating. A space that had always felt safe and familiar now seemed foreign, like she no longer belonged. "Carl, is everything okay?" Maria asked softly, her voice filled with apprehension. She tried to step closer, but a palpable tension held her back, an unseen wall of discomfort. Without turning, Carl responded, his voice devoid of emotion. "We need to talk." Those words cut deep, leaving Maria feeling as though the ground was slipping from beneath her. She struggled to stay composed. "Talk? About what?" she asked, her heart pounding. "You've been so distant lately. Did I do something wrong?" Carl finally turned, but the look he gave her was unfamiliar. There was no warmth, no trace of the care he once showed her. His eyes held only a blank, detached stare. He moved toward the table, absent-mindedly reaching for a glass of water he had seemingly forgotten, but didn't even notice it. "Maria." "This is it," he stated bluntly, not even trying to soften the blow. "I can't keep doing this." His words hit her like a landslide. This is it? Maria's thoughts scrambled as panic rose inside her, but she knew she needed answers. "What are you saying, Carl? Are you telling me you don't want to be with me anymore?" she asked, her voice edged with unease. Carl dragged a hand across his face, frustration apparent. "This was a mistake. I got involved with you because I was lonely." "But you're broke, Maria. You should have known better than to think there was anything real here," he said, his tone cold and sharp as a knife. Maria stood frozen. The sting of his words hit so hard that she felt her knees weaken. "Broke? Is that really how you see me? Just a passing amusement?" Maria asked, barely believing what she was hearing. With a shake of his head, Carl looked at her with impatience, as though everything he was saying should have been obvious. "Maria, take a look around. Look at me. Look at yourself." He motioned toward the luxurious room around them. "We're from different worlds. Did you really think I'd give all this up for a maid? Be realistic." His words were so merciless that Maria felt her eyes sting, but she fought to keep her tears from falling. How could he be so heartless? How could he speak to her like that? She thought, feeling her heart crack. "You never said anything like this before," she managed, her voice shaking. "You made it seem like there was something real between us." Carl gave a short, humorless laugh, heading toward the door. "Something real. Maria, I was just killing time. I never promised you anything." "You misled yourself," he added, completely unashamed. His words left Maria in shock, each one stripping away any hope she still had that their relationship meant something to him. "So, you just used me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Used?" Carl scoffed, indifferent. Don't be dramatic. You knew this couldn't last. People like you don't fit in my world. I need someone at my level, not someone who's barely scraping by." He dismissed her without a second thought. Maria's whole body shook with a blend of anger and deep hurt. How could he be this heartless? The man she had trusted, who she thought valued her, was treating her like she didn't matter at all. "Do you think you can treat me this way just because I don't have money?" she asked, her voice cracking with the raw edge of pain and frustration. "I actually believed you," she began, but Carl cut her off, raising a hand to silence her. "Enough, Maria. I've said what I needed to say. This is done, and I want you out of the mansion by tomorrow morning." Maria could barely breathe. He wasn't just ending things, he was firing her. He was pushing her out of both his life and her job in a single brutal moment, as if she were disposable. Her head spun, but she forced herself to keep her composure. "You can't just do this, Carl," she said, her tears finally slipping down her face. "I'm not just your maid. I'm a person, and you led me to believe I meant something." Carl stepped closer, looking into her eyes with a chilling, indifferent gaze. "You can think whatever you want, but the truth is, you were never more than a convenient distraction. This is over. Accept it and don't come back." Maria was stunned. The coldness, the cruelty. He was like a different person entirely. She couldn't stand it any longer. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her heart aching, as though it were being ripped apart. The door closed firmly behind her, and Maria felt as though her entire world had crumbled in mere moments. She had nowhere to go, no plan, but it was clear that Carl didn't care. To him, she was nothing more than a memory he'd quickly discard. Her feet felt heavy as she walked down the wide corridor of the mansion, each step sinking with the weight of rejection. Her shoulders slumped, not from the worn bag she carried, but from the crushing weight of Carl's words. Her mind replayed every moment, every dismissive look. What she'd believed was a real relationship had been reduced to nothing. Now, she was simply an unemployed, directionless woman. Just a temporary thrill, she thought, her heart squeezing painfully. Every memory they'd shared, every stolen moment, now felt like a painful illusion. To Carl, she was nothing more than an insignificant woman with no worth. Maria couldn't believe she'd been so naive. How could I have let myself fall for this? She walked to the tiny room she stayed in, tucked away in the mansion's service area. Once a place she felt safe, the walls now seemed to close in on her, a stinging reminder of just how little she meant to Carl. She sank down on the bed, feeling the weight of her tears start to fall. "I can't believe it ended like this." "He tossed me aside like I was worthless," she whispered, as she gathered her few belongings into her backpack. Each movement hurt, as if every item packed away marked another piece of her broken heart. Her possessions were minimal, the basics for someone who spent her days just getting by. Standing in that small room one last time, Maria felt something shatter deep within her. In mere minutes, her life had been stripped bare by Carl's cutting words and his dismissal of her as poor and unimportant. Though she knew she should leave, Maria couldn't shake the urge to at least try to understand why. "I have to get back up. I can't let him crush me," she resolved, her spirit refusing to be defeated. Despite his clear rejection, something inside her needed more than those cruel words. With her backpack slung over her shoulder, she climbed the stairs once more, each step an act of willpower. Her mind raced, swirling with questions about what might come next. She stopped at Carl's office door, hesitating before she knocked. Silence. She knocked again, louder, until footsteps finally approached. But when the door opened, it wasn't Carl who greeted her. Another employee stood there, looking at her with an awkward sympathy. "Mr. Carl," doesn't wish to be disturbed," he said firmly, though his expression revealed he understood all too well what had happened. Maria tried to reason with him, but the man stood firm, blocking her path. He said he had made up his mind, and there was no point in arguing. She felt a tightness in her throat, but knew pressing him wouldn't change anything. He doesn't even want to listen, not a single word. It was as if she was already erased from his life, as if everything they'd shared was meaningless. With no other choice, Maria descended the stairs one final time, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. She walked through the mansion's grand hall, eyes lowered, while memories flooded her mind. All the moments they had together, the laughter, the stolen glances, now felt like innocent dreams. I was nothing to him. As she reached the gate, she paused to steady herself. The air felt thick, almost as if the world around her sensed what had just happened. That's when she overheard voices coming from a few maids, chatting by the garden. They were laughing, unaware of her presence nearby. "Did you hear?" one of them whispered, barely containing her excitement. "Mr. Carl's getting married soon, securing that fortune." Maria froze. Married? The word hit her like a punch. She felt the breath leave her, her feet rooted in place. To someone else? The words echoed painfully in her mind. "Yeah, I heard her family owns multiple businesses. Perfect for him, rich, beautiful, not like some of his past flings," the other woman replied with a chuckle, and Maria's stomach twisted. Each word felt like venom, weakening her bit by bit. She stood there, paralyzed, as the two laughed and chattered about the bright future Carl would share with Cynthia, the woman who clearly offered everything he needed. He had it all mapped out. And I thought it mattered, she thought, as a wave of dizziness swept over her. Maria tried to step forward toward the gate, but her legs wobbled. The world began to blur, the maids' voices drifting away. Her heart pounded, her breaths shallow. The pressure in her chest grew with each second. I can't do this," was her last thought before everything went black. Maria's body couldn't hold out any longer, and she collapsed onto the hard, cold pavement, her heart heavy with unspoken pain. Hours later she woke up, under a blinding light that burned through her closed eyelids, the sharp smell of disinfectant filling her nose. Gradually, the sounds around her sharpened, and she realized she was in a hospital bed. Her senses were foggy, and a faint dizziness lingered as she slowly opened her eyes, blinking until the face of a doctor came into focus by her bedside. "You're awake at last," he said, looking serious as he jotted down notes on his clipboard. "We were concerned. Someone saw you collapse on the street and brought you in," he explained. Maria tried to sit up, but a dull, throbbing pain pulsed in her head. Her memory was blurry. Carl's harsh words, the crushing weight of everything, and then nothing. How did my life get to this point, she wondered, struggling to gather her thoughts. "You suffered from a collapse," the doctor continued, noticing her confused look. "It's likely the result of all the physical and emotional stress you've been carrying. And there's one more thing I need to tell you." His tone was calm, yet there was a seriousness in his voice that sent a shiver down her spine. Maria's heart started racing as she looked at him, bracing herself for what was coming. "One more thing? How could there possibly be more?" "You're pregnant," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "Pregnant with triplets, actually. Congratulations. We ran some tests to ensure everything was okay when you were admitted." The words landed like a blow, and Maria felt the room spinning again. Pregnant with triplets. She stared at the doctor in disbelief, as if he had just told her something impossible. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Triplets? I didn't even know." She sank back into the bed, feeling as if the weight of this new reality was pressing down on her entire body, too heavy to bear. "It's true," the doctor said gently, his face filled with concern. "The tests confirm it, but this pregnancy is high risk, especially with everything you're going through. You'll need constant care and medical supervision." Maria's mind swirled with a storm of emotions. Losing her job, Carl's coldness, the way she'd been cast aside like she didn't matter, all of it hit her at once. And now, the reality of carrying triplets made her heart sink even deeper. How am I supposed to handle this? How can I even survive? She wondered, feeling the weight of these thoughts press down on her chest. "You'll need plenty of rest and ongoing medical care," the doctor continued, though his voice seemed to drift away as she struggled to absorb everything. "The health of you and your babies relies on this care," he added carefully. "And with triplets, the risks are even higher." Maria closed her eyes, fighting to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. The thought of Carl's disdain surfaced again, and now she was carrying his children, a truth that felt painfully ironic. "He'll never know," she thought bitterly, her feelings a mix of anger and despair. "He'd never care anyway." "I just don't know what to do," Maria whispered, her voice shaky and filled with uncertainty. "I have no one. No way to pay for all this care. I just lost my job." Her words tumbled out, tinged with nervousness and fear. The doctor paused, sympathy in his eyes, but no easy answers to offer. He'd seen desperate situations before, but hers was uniquely heartbreaking. "You're going to need some support," he said, softening his tone. "This isn't something you can do alone." Maria knew the truth. She was alone. She had no family to turn to, and Carl was out of the picture. Abandonment settled in, heavy and suffocating, as she stared around the hospital room, unable to focus. "What am I supposed to do with 3 babies? I don't have a home, a job, anything." Her voice trembled, and before the doctor could say another word, she tried to stand. Her legs were weak, but her mind was resolute. "I have to go. I can't stay here. I don't have any way to pay for this," she said firmly, moving toward the door. "Wait," the doctor urged, concern deepening. "If you leave now without the care you need, you risk endangering the pregnancy. It's dangerous, Maria." But she was already set on leaving. She couldn't afford the care. She had no support, no safety net, and no time to stand still. She had to keep going, no matter what. "If I don't step up, who's going to be there for these babies? I'm on my own here. I have to figure out a way to give my kids a decent life." These thoughts raced through her mind, panic bubbling inside. Without a word, she dressed, brushing off the doctor's worried gaze. Her legs felt weak, yet she summoned the strength to walk toward the door. Every step seemed to press down on her with the weight of what lay ahead. Not just a broken life anymore, but 3 new ones forming inside her. 3 babies. 3 souls who would soon rely on her. "I have to pull it together. I need to build a future for my children." When she reached the hospital doors, the cold night air hit her face, pulling her harshly back to reality. She paused for a moment, looking around as if the empty street might somehow hold the answers she was searching for. "And now, where do I go?" The question echoed through her, but no answer came. Her hand gripped the strap of her backpack, which now seemed unbearably heavy. A wave of despair and uncertainty began to wash over her. The path ahead felt desolate, and for the first time, Maria found herself utterly directionless. No money, no job, and 3 babies on the way. How will I survive? She walked through the deserted streets, the biting wind stinging her face and making her skin prickle. The isolation and fear were almost too much. She held her backpack close, clinging to it as the only solid thing she had. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer and fears that only grew. How will I raise these babies by myself? How will I get through this? But one thing was clear. There was no going back to Carl, not after the rejection he'd shown her. 6 months along, and the reality of her pregnancy was now impossible to avoid. Her belly was growing, bringing new struggles with it. With no steady income, she got by however she could, taking odd jobs, cleaning houses, doing laundry, even selling a few personal items just to get by. But it was barely enough to support herself, let alone the babies she'd soon be caring for. "What more can I do?" Maria muttered to herself, scrubbing the floors of the small house where she'd managed to get a one-day cleaning gig. Her back throbbed with pain, and the physical strain was starting to wear her down. Each day just gets harder. How am I supposed to keep this up? She straightened briefly, taking a deep breath to relieve some of the pressure on her belly. Her triplets shifted inside her, almost as if they sensed her stress. Maria kept going, determined to save every penny she could, hoping to scrape together enough for her children. As her pregnancy progressed, her body showed signs of serious fatigue. Weakness hit her more often now, and dizzy spells took her by surprise. Still, she couldn't afford to stop. "I have to push through. For them." But doubt crept in, no matter how much she tried convincing herself she could handle it. At the end of an especially grueling day, she sank into a worn-out chair in the corner of her tiny, stifling room. It was the best she could afford with what little she'd saved, far from comfortable. The summer heat made the place feel like an oven, and Maria fanned herself with an old magazine, exhausted and heavy. Will I be able to give them even the basics? How can I take care of 3 babies on my own? Sometimes she thought about Carl, but her pride kept her from even entertaining the idea of asking for help. He left me, tossed me aside, without a second thought. I won't be begging for anything from him. His harsh words, calling her poor and insignificant, still haunted her. The disdain in his gaze reminded her she couldn't go back. She didn't want to depend on someone who had made her feel worthless. As the days dragged on, her situation only worsened. Cleaning jobs that she could once handle with effort now felt impossible. The weight of her pregnancy pressed painfully on her back. The nausea returned in full force, and her energy seemed to drain more with each passing hour. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." As another grueling day came to an end, Maria felt the exhaustion seep into her bones, her hands trembling from fatigue. Each step felt like an impossible task. That evening, as she finally lay in bed, her body ached too much to find rest. She shifted and turned, desperately trying to ease the strain on her aching back and the persistent throbbing in her swollen feet. Things are getting tougher, but I have to keep pushing, she thought. Her mind raced, and the weight of despair settled heavily in her chest. How will I provide what they need? I have nothing left. The heat of the tiny room and the suffocating air forced her to rise in the middle of the night. She made her way to the window, her hands shaking, her strength fading with each passing moment. The loneliness and helplessness washed over her. Staring out into the silent, empty street, a sudden, sharp pain made her freeze. A fierce pressure gripped her lower abdomen. No, not now. The pain was so intense her legs nearly buckled, and she clung to the wall for support. I can't be going into labor. It's too soon, she gasped, struggling to steady her breathing as the pain only intensified. Her body felt like it was turning against her, and a terrifying thought crept in. Is this the end? Are my babies in danger? Panic mixed with fear, and as Maria reached for her phone on the nightstand, a fresh wave of pain sent her to her knees, immobilizing her. I need help. Her heart pounded as she fumbled to dial 911. The pain was unbearable, and she felt like her body was unraveling. Time became a blur of agony, fear, and a desperation she could hardly process. I can't lose these babies. Not now, she thought, choking back tears as she managed to call for an ambulance. Finally, the medics arrived, placing her carefully onto a stretcher. Their voices sounded distant over her labored breaths. Just breathe. We'll get you to the hospital fast. The words barely registered, but Maria held on, clinging to every ounce of consciousness. She knew that every second mattered. They were counting on her. I have to hold on for them. As the ambulance sped through the city streets, Maria's face was slick with sweat, her mind caught between moments of clarity and overwhelming dread. Am I going to lose my babies? Can I keep going? She shut her eyes tightly, feeling each wave of pain intensify. What had started as a battle against poverty and isolation had transformed into a fight for her children's lives. The ambulance screeched into the hospital, red and white lights flashing in a chaotic blur. Maria could barely see through the haze of pain. Each contraction felt like an unstoppable storm tearing through her. The paramedics rushed her through the hospital doors, every second counting. She was barely holding on, her body worn down, struggling with the early labor that had come too soon. Maria tried to focus on the faces around her, but the bright lights and the whirlwind of voices blurred everything. You need to stay calm, a nurse said, gripping her hand. We're doing everything we can, but the babies are arriving very early. The nurse's calm tone betrayed a hint of worry. Please, save my babies, Maria whispered, nearly out of strength. Desperation consumed her. They have to make it. I can't lose them. The lead doctor, face grave, looked her way as he reviewed her vitals. Your babies are extremely premature, which brings serious risks. We need to start now, or we may lose them, he said bluntly, his words cutting through any hope of illusions. Maria felt the ground slipping out from under her. She was alone, about to bring 3 fragile lives into a world filled with uncertainty. The pain, physical and emotional, threatened to pull her under, but she knew she had no choice. She had to fight for them. If it takes my life to save theirs, so be it. The thought repeated in her mind as chaos took over around her. The medical team prepped her for emergency surgery. The scene seemed to fade, as if she were observing from outside herself. The heart monitor's steady beep echoed, and each sound felt like it was pulling her further from reality. Will I get to see them grow? Will I even get to meet them? I need a miracle. They need to be born safe. God, please help me. Help my babies. They need me. Please let me make it through, to love them and take care of them. She whispered a silent prayer as another surge of pain tore through her abdomen. The medical team worked with swift, precise movements, but the weight of urgency hung in the room. She could feel the tension in their expressions and gestures, the seriousness of the situation clear. The contractions were relentless. They're coming way too early, one doctor muttered to another. We need those incubators ready for all 3. Every second matters. I can't lose them, Maria murmured, feeling a fresh wave of despair. The room seemed to spin, and her breathing grew shallower with every passing moment. She felt at the edge of her strength, yet her will to fight for her babies held her steady. I promised myself I'd protect them, and I will. We'll get through this. We will. Her resolve hardened. The doctor turned to her again, his expression serious. We'll do everything possible, but the risks are very real. They're so tiny, so fragile, he said quietly. Their chances, it's not looking good. He stepped closer, preparing to start the early delivery. Tears slipped down Maria's face. Everything was out of her hands now, left to forces she couldn't control. Please, God, let them make it, she thought. I couldn't go on without them. Fear clouded her mind, and the helplessness weighed on her. The labor stretched on, draining her energy. Time felt meaningless as her thoughts fractured between the physical agony and the dread of losing her babies. The room was filled with tense silence, broken only by the whirring machines and quick commands from the doctors. "Let's move. We need to get them out now. Everyone, stay focused. This is critical. The lives of 3 babies and 1 mother are on the line. We're doing all we can, though the odds are stacked against us," the lead doctor called out. Moments later, the first baby arrived, but the silence that followed was crushing. There was no first cry, no sound Maria longed to hear. The newborn was immediately passed to a team working frantically to stabilize him. Exhausted, Maria tried to lift her head to catch a glimpse of her son, but a doctor gently held her down. "Stay calm. We're taking care of them. Just stay with us," he urged, but it was almost impossible to steady her thoughts. As she lay in labor, Maria could feel something wasn't right. The first baby arrived in silence, no cries filling the air. "Please tell me they're all right," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "The second one is on the way," the doctor said, his gaze focused intently on the procedure. But the second baby entered the world just as silently, whisked away without a sound. Maria's heart clenched. Why weren't they crying? What was happening? "I need my babies," she thought, panic rising. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Maria could feel the severity of the situation weighing heavily on her. But the silence in the room was unbearable. "They're in an extremely delicate condition," a nurse beside her said softly, her tone filled with sympathy. They were doing everything they could. Moments later, Maria gave birth to her third child. But again, silence. Not a single cry to bring comfort. The babies were taken immediately to the neonatal unit. "My babies. My 3 babies," Maria repeated silently, as if the words alone could hold her together. The doctor finally came over, but Maria was drifting into unconsciousness from pure exhaustion. "Your babies have been born, but they're all in critical condition," he told her, his face somber. "They're receiving intensive care, but the coming hours are crucial. We can't say if they'll make it." Maria's world shattered. The thought of losing her children, who she had fought so hard for, felt like her own life slipping away. "Please, do everything you can." "I'd give anything," she whispered, her last words before darkness claimed her. Maria woke in a quiet, sterile hospital room, the cold scent of disinfectant and the low hum of machines grounding her in reality. Her whole body felt heavy, both physically and emotionally weighed down by a crushing exhaustion. The instant her eyes adjusted, her first thought went to the babies. "My babies, are they still holding on? They have to make it." She found herself haunted by regrets. Maybe if she'd worked fewer hours or managed a little better. But no, she couldn't let herself spiral down that path. She forced herself to try to sit up, clinging to the faintest hope. Just then, a nurse by her side noticed her stirring and approached, her face gentle, yet filled with worry. "You've been through quite an ordeal," the nurse said softly, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "You need to rest now, but I know you're eager for an update on your little ones." Maria gave a weak nod, her heart pounding with worry. "I have to see them. Are they going to be okay?" Her voice trembled with urgency. The uncertainty gnawed at her, the thought of her babies in danger filling her with dread. "It's too early to tell," the nurse replied cautiously. "They're in the neonatal ICU, and the doctors are doing everything possible. But it's still critical. Right now, all we can do is wait and pray." The words stung Maria deeply. Wait and pray. It sounded so passive, so insufficient, considering how much her babies meant to her. She couldn't bear to stay there, lying helpless. "I want to see them. I need to be by their side," she said, her voice both shaky and resolute. With the nurse's help, Maria slowly got out of bed, her body weak from the recent delivery. Every step toward the ICU was a struggle, yet nothing would stop her from reaching her babies. "They need me. I can't leave them alone. They have to know that I'm here, that I'm fighting for them, right here by their side," she whispered, her determination fierce. When she finally reached the ICU, her heart ached at the sight before her. Through the glass, she could see her tiny triplets, each enclosed in an incubator, connected to an array of tubes and machines. The quiet was interrupted only by the steady hum of the monitors. The sight took her breath away. Her eyes fixed on the fragile forms of her babies. Her mind raced. "They're so small. How can they survive this?" she thought, tears filling her eyes. A doctor entered and started examining the babies, but his expression offered little reassurance. "I would give anything for them to be okay," she murmured, hope and desperation mingling in her gaze. "If only I could do more." The responsibility felt crushing. She was alone, with no resources or support, watching her children fight for their lives. Days blurred together, each filled with endless waiting. Yet she stayed, driven by love and an unwavering will to be there for her babies. Maria barely touched her food or found any rest, staying in the same spot in the ICU hallway, always keeping her gaze on her children. "They need to feel I'm here, that I won't leave them," she told herself daily, struggling against the helplessness clawing at her, refusing to entertain the thought of surrender. As days passed, Maria began looking for ways to support herself without leaving the hospital. Her savings were gone, and the idea of stepping away from her kids' side wasn't even an option. So, she took on a cleaning job at the hospital, handling small tasks while waiting for updates about her children. "If I don't work, I won't be able to keep up with the bills. They need to have everything. I'll make sure they don't go without," she thought as she swept one of the corridors. With every movement, the physical and emotional exhaustion weighed on her. But she pressed on, determined to scrape together every dollar she could. "It's the only thing I can do for them right now." Even though she was weak, she felt a need to keep a sense of control over the situation. The work was demanding, especially given that her recent pregnancy and labor had left her worn down. But she kept going, treating the cleaning duties with the same attention she'd always put into everything she did. "I have to stay strong," she reminded herself, pushing past the aching back and deepening fatigue. "I have to do this for them." Between hours of cleaning and stretches of waiting outside the ICU, Maria whispered silent prayers for her baby's recovery. Each time a doctor or nurse entered the ICU, her heart leapt, desperate for hopeful news. But the uncertainty persisted. "It's still too soon to say if they'll make it," the doctor had told her repeatedly, and those words replayed in her mind constantly. One especially hard night, Maria finally allowed herself a few minutes of sleep in the hospital corridor. Suddenly, a nurse shook her awake. "Maria," the woman said with a worried look, "one of your babies has taken a turn for the worse. He's experiencing severe respiratory complications, and the doctors need to perform emergency surgery." The nurse's voice was urgent. Maria's heart felt like it stopped. She struggled to stand up, despite her body's weakness because of her panic. "Surgery? But why? My baby? How did it come to this? Is there no other way?" she asked, her voice shaking. Maria's hands were cold and slick with sweat as she tried to absorb the shock. "The doctors are getting everything ready now," the nurse said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll do everything we can, but it's a delicate situation." Maria felt the world slipping from beneath her feet. I can't lose him. Not now, she thought, battling the despair pressing in on her. She clenched her lips together, forcing back tears, her gaze fixed on the medical team preparing for the procedure. Moments later, she found herself sitting in a small chair outside the operating room, eyes glued to the door. Her thoughts swirled in panic as the dread of losing her baby consumed her. Everything around her seemed distant and blurry, as if the sounds of people, machine beeps and hurried footsteps were coming from another world. All that mattered was the fragile life in that room, fighting to survive. Please let him make it. I can't bear to lose anyone, she prayed, her heart pounding with anxiety. As she waited for news, Maria's mind drifted between fragile hope and overpowering dread. Time felt like it was crawling. Each minute felt like a lifetime, piling on her anxiety and exhausting her emotionally. They said they'd do their best, but will it be enough? She clasped her hands in her lap, trying to calm herself, though it felt futile. Her mind raced through every worst-case scenario she could imagine, each one more devastating than the last. She stood and began pacing down the hospital corridor. Then, in the middle of the hall, she noticed an elderly woman, her face worn with age, moving slowly and looking lost. The woman appeared confused, glancing around as if struggling to remember where she needed to go. Maria, without a second thought, approached her, her instinct to help momentarily ease her own pain. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" she asked gently, offering her hand. The woman looked back at her, a mixture of relief and confusion in her eyes. "Oh, my dear," she murmured. "I'm lost. I can't seem to find my friend's room. He was brought in here, but all these hallways look exactly the same to me," said the woman, her voice quivering with a fragile tone. Despite feeling utterly drained, Maria managed a gentle smile at the elderly woman and reached out to steady her. "Let me help you find him. Don't worry. We'll get there together." As they walked through the seemingly endless corridors, Maria recognized that, even in the depths of her own struggles, she could still offer help. Maybe that's what life is about, she thought. Even when we think we're empty, there's always something we can give. During their walk, the woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Martha chatted with Maria, her gratitude shining through. "You're a kind soul. Have you been working here long?" she asked, noticing Maria's uniform. With a tired sigh, Maria answered, "Actually, no. I'm here because my 3 babies are in the NICU. They were born far too early, and right now one of them is in surgery." She paused. "I'm doing everything I can to keep them alive. The hospital bills keep piling up, and it's just me. But I won't let them go without." Mrs. Martha stopped, looking intently into Maria's eyes. "Triplets," she repeated, her voice softening. "You're weathering a storm most wouldn't even dream of. And yet here you are, helping a lost old woman like me. That speaks volumes about you." Maria felt an unexpected warmth from Mrs. Martha's admiration. "I have no other choice. I have to keep pushing forward. If I stop, who will be there for them?" she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're my world now. But it's so hard. I feel so alone," she admitted quietly. Gently squeezing Maria's hand, Mrs. Martha whispered, "Sometimes the toughest roads reveal our true selves. Your strength, dear, is what will save your children. Keep holding on and don't let go of hope." Her words stirred something deep in Maria, and for a brief moment she felt a spark of hope rise within her. After helping Mrs. Martha find her friend's room, Maria returned to the ICU. The hours following the surgery felt like an eternity, filled with overwhelming tension as she waited outside, watching doctors rush in and out. The surgery had been essential to save her son's life, but the risks were high. Did he make it? Will my son survive? The questions ran through her mind, mingling hope with despair. Finally, after what felt like endless hours, the surgeon appeared in the hallway. Maria's heart raced as he approached, and while his face was hard to read, there was a certain calmness in his expression that brought her a flicker of relief. "Maria," he began, his voice both steady and compassionate. "The surgery was complex, but we were able to stabilize your baby. Right now he's under close watch, and there's still a lot we need to monitor in the coming hours. But for now, he's out of immediate danger." Maria let out a long, shaky breath, as if she'd been holding it in for ages. This time, the tears in her eyes weren't from fear, but pure gratitude. "My baby's alive." He pulled through. Relief washed over her, and she felt her knees go weak. "I don't even know how to thank you," Maria stammered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for saving my son." Her words came out between sobs of relief, and she clasped her trembling hands together, almost as if in prayer. The doctor gave a gentle nod, a small smile on his face. "We're doing everything we can, Maria. But keep in mind, the road to recovery is going to be a long one. He's still so little, and he'll need intensive care for the next several weeks. He's going to make it. He'll survive." "I have to believe that," Maria thought as she watched the doctor walk away. Her heart still felt heavy, but there was hope now, a glimpse of light at the end of this dark tunnel. She knew it would be a hard journey, but knowing her son had made it through the surgery renewed her strength. She settled back into the ICU chair, looking through the glass. The 3 tiny bodies in their incubators were her entire world. And now she felt an even greater drive to keep pushing forward. "They're fighters, and I need to be too," she told herself. "More than ever, I can't give up now." The next morning, after another sleepless night, Maria returned to the neonatal ICU to check on her baby's progress. Time crawled painfully, the weight gnawing at her. She could hardly think of anything but the surgery and her fragile baby's fight for life. If only there were more I could do. One day, as Maria was trying to gather herself in the hospital corridor, a nurse approached her with a kind smile, handing her an envelope. "Maria, someone left this for you yesterday," the nurse said gently, her eyes warm. "Looks like they wanted to offer some help." Maria's hands shook as she opened the envelope, not expecting anything like this. Inside, she found a generous sum of money and a heartfelt note that read, "Maria, your kindness and resilience left a strong impression on me. Don't let life's burdens weigh you down. Here's a little help for your kids. Use it however you see best. Remember, you're stronger than you realize. With warm regards, Lady Martha." Maria felt tears well up in her eyes as she took in the kindness of a stranger. She cared about me. She doesn't even know me, yet she cared enough to help. The gesture touched her deeply. For the first time in ages, she felt a glimmer of hope and a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. "One day, I'll repay every cent," she thought to herself, moved not by the money itself, but by the kindness in her darkest hour. "It's comforting to know there are still good-hearted people out there," she thought, as she used the money to cover a portion of her baby's medical expenses. As she stood in front of the ICU window, looking at her children fighting for their lives, a new determination sparked within her. "I'm not giving up. I'll keep fighting for you, no matter what." The strength she felt was like a renewed fire, pushing her forward. A few days later, Lady Martha returned to the hospital to visit Maria. The 2 women shared a quiet moment together. Maria, still in disbelief, asked, "Why did you help me? You didn't have to do that." Lady Martha gave a soft, mysterious smile, her gaze steady. "I saw something in you, dear. A strength you might not have recognized yet. We all need a helping hand at some point. Call on me whenever you need," she replied gently, her words like a beacon in the storm of Maria's life. The days following the surgery were agonizing. Maria spent hours in front of the ICU glass, watching her tiny child, surrounded by tubes and machines, each sound from the equipment a harsh reminder of how fragile his life was. Maria could hardly close her eyes to rest, her thoughts trapped in an endless loop of worry, fearing that any second something might go wrong. She whispered a prayer, her weary face reflected against the ICU glass. Please don't take my children from me. They've already been through so much. I would give anything just to watch them grow. The burden she carried seemed to double with every passing minute, yet she knew she couldn't afford to waver. The doctors and nurses did all they could, and after what felt like an eternity, there was a faint but unmistakable glimmer of hope. One morning, the doctor approached with a calmer expression. "The surgery went well, Maria. Your baby is showing signs of recovery. It'll be a slow process, but we finally have reason to feel optimistic." Maria could barely absorb the words. Her heart swelled with gratitude, and for the first time in weeks, she breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank God," she murmured, her eyes brimming with tears. "I knew they were strong. I knew my babies would pull through." Her faith was paying off, bringing her the strength she needed to keep going. The following days saw small, steady improvements. Though still fragile, her 3 babies began to gain weight and breathe more easily with the machine's support. Every little victory felt like a miracle, and Maria made sure she was there to celebrate each one. "You're my little fighters," she thought tenderly, watching over them. "Nothing in this world will take you from me." As the weeks passed, the day that once felt so far away finally arrived. Maria was able to bring her babies home. When the nurse handed her each of the tiny bundles wrapped in blankets, Maria felt a rush of joy mixed with a pang of fear. Can I really do this alone? How can I manage 3 babies at once? Doubts clouded her mind, but she knew these children were her world, and she'd go to the ends of the earth to give them the best life possible, no matter how hard it might be. As she placed her babies in the stroller to leave the hospital, she looked back at the building that had been her refuge for so many weeks. A wave of gratitude washed over her, mingling with the anxious thoughts of what lay ahead. I got them this far. But now what? She wondered, pushing the stroller down the hall, feeling the weight of the responsibilities awaiting her, yet also the lightness of finally taking her babies home. When Maria returned to her tiny apartment, she carefully arranged the 3 cribs she'd managed to get through some much-needed donations. The place was cramped, the paint on the walls was peeling, but to her, it was still home. One by one, she laid her babies down in their cribs. Tears lingered in her eyes as she watched them, feeling the weight of finally being back together. "We made it, my loves. We're home." But the relief of being back soon faded as reality settled in. The triplets' needs came fast and unending. Nights without sleep became the new normal, with cries waking her every hour. Maria barely had a chance to rest. Caring for 3 newborns required every ounce of her energy, and she quickly found herself overwhelmed. "How am I supposed to do this every day? It's too much," she whispered, while changing one baby's diaper and rocking another in her arms. The exhaustion wore her down, and with each day, the fear of not being able to cope grew, but she refused to surrender. "I'll find a way," she told herself, determined. They depended on her, and she was resolved to stay strong for them. That promise became her mantra, her anchor, reminding her to press on, even in the hardest moments. Amid this chaos, Maria came across a letter buried among the stack of bills. Her heart pounded as she saw the hospital's seal on the envelope. With trembling hands, she opened it, bracing herself. The letter was cold and matter-of-fact, informing her that her medical debt had now soared beyond her ability to pay. On top of this, her rent was overdue, and her landlord had already issued an eviction warning. "How am I going to pay all of this?" she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she took in the harsh reality. The looming threat of eviction and overwhelming medical debt weighed heavily on her. How am I supposed to keep a roof over my kids' heads, she thought, feeling despair press on her chest like a weight. She had fought so hard to get here, and it felt like everything was crumbling. Clutching the letter, she could feel the paper wrinkle beneath her fingers. I've fought so hard. This can't be the end, she thought, glancing at her babies, sleeping soundly in their cribs. She'd fought hard to make it this far, vowing to do whatever was necessary to keep them safe. Yet now, with bills piling up and the possibility of losing her home becoming more real by the day, she questioned how much longer she could hold on. Meanwhile, Carl stood in the grand foyer of the mansion, watching as the staff buzzed around, setting up for the big wedding ahead. He tried to focus on the details, the flawless flower arrangements, the glittering chandeliers that cast a dazzling glow over the room. Yet his mind drifted, filled with an unshakable discomfort. Why don't I feel happy, he thought. This should be a milestone, something worth celebrating. Then he noticed Cynthia bustling through the hall with her clipboard, issuing orders with the same precision she used to track every penny of the event. Cynthia stopped in front of a young employee, hurriedly adjusting a tablecloth. "Are you testing my patience?" she snapped, her tone sharp and irritated. The young woman, visibly nervous, tried to respond, but Cynthia cut her off abruptly. "I ordered the finest silk tablecloths, and you bring me this cheap excuse? Do you think this is some backyard get-together?" Cynthia advanced, her expression cold, her eyes filled with disdain. The employee stumbled over her words, explaining she was only following instructions, but Cynthia waved her off. "No excuses. Either do your job right or get out," Cynthia said, her voice cutting through the room. The girl shrank back, her face flushed with embarrassment. Others glanced over, the tension palpable, before quickly returning to their tasks, wanting to avoid any confrontation. Carl took it all in, a twist of discomfort knotting in his stomach. Cynthia's treatment of the employee stirred something in him. Why does this bother me so much, he wondered. Her words echoed in his mind, and suddenly he was jolted back to a time when he'd acted similarly, toward Maria. He vividly remembered how he'd dismissed her, pushed her aside without a second thought, prioritizing his own ego over her feelings. Guilt crept over him, realizing that he'd justified his behavior by convincing himself it was necessary and that she simply didn't belong in his world. But now, watching Cynthia humiliate someone the same way, he couldn't deny a shift in his perspective. I was cruel. But why? Was my pride really worth it? The realization hit him hard, revealing there was more than just tension in the air. Cynthia, still visibly frustrated, approached him without noticing Carl's thoughtful expression. "These people can't seem to get anything right. I'm probably going to have to go over the entire team," she grumbled, clearly annoyed with the young employee's mistake. Carl paused, choosing his words carefully before speaking. "Don't you think you might have been a little too harsh on her? Everyone's doing their best, Cynthia. It was probably just an honest mistake." His tone was calm, but carried an unusual firmness. Cynthia looked at him, visibly surprised. "Harsh? Carl, this is our wedding. We can't afford mistakes like this. This isn't some small gathering. It's the event of the year." She rolled her eyes, as though Carl's comment was entirely out of line. He exhaled slowly, feeling the discomfort deepen. Event of the year? Is that really all she cares about? He wondered, realizing how differently Cynthia seemed to view their wedding. It was becoming clear to him that Cynthia was caught up in the details and in how everything would look to others, treating the wedding as if it were just a way to showcase their status and wealth. Over the next few days, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Cynthia talked endlessly about the ceremony's expenses, constantly emphasizing how everything had to be flawless to impress the guests. "We need more exotic flowers, and I've decided to upgrade the catering to something more high-end. Sure, it'll cost double, but it'll be unforgettable," she said, barely glancing at him as she jotted down new plans on her clipboard. Carl began to wonder if she truly cared about the marriage itself, or just the image it would project. Every conversation seemed to center around money, appearances, and how the wedding could boost their social standing. When did we start talking only about money? He found himself thinking more and more often. He couldn't ignore the growing disconnect between them. One evening, as they ate in silence, Cynthia finally broke it, bubbling with excitement about something Carl hadn't grasped yet. "I spoke with the team today, and you'll never guess. Our wedding is going to secure a huge business deal with one of the family's biggest investors. The wedding will elevate us to a whole new status," she said, like it was the announcement of a lifetime. Carl paused mid-bite, his fork hanging in mid-air. He looked at her, still processing her words. The wedding. He'd thought of it as a celebration of love, a union meant to solidify their lives together. But now, it felt more like another rung on Cynthia's social and financial ladder. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice unintentionally low and tense. "You actually see our wedding as a business transaction?" Cynthia didn't pick up on the gravity in his tone. "Of course, Carl. It's an amazing move for us," she replied. "We'll reinforce our business connections, and our standing in the industry will be even stronger. Isn't that what powerful couples aim for?" Her words hit Carl like an icy gust. Now, everything made sense. The fixation on every detail, the sky-high expenses, the insistence on flawless execution. She's more invested in appearances and status than in building a real life together, he thought, sadness creeping over him. Maria sat on the worn-out sofa in the cramped living room, watching her triplets finally sleep in their makeshift cribs in the corner. Bills were stacked on the coffee table, each one a reminder of the weight crushing down on her. She was bone-tired, her eyes stinging from exhaustion, but sleep was out of the question. How am I supposed to cover rent? And the medical bills? I can't afford to lose this place, not with the babies still so fragile. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, though worry was closing around her heart like a vice. Then came a loud, urgent knock that echoed through the tiny house. Maria's heart skipped as she stood up, dread washing over her. She had a feeling she knew who it was. The landlord, notorious for his merciless approach, had been hounding her for the late rent. She opened the door slowly, and there he was, standing tall and cold-eyed. "You know why I'm here," he said, his voice deep and unyielding. "Rent's been overdue for weeks, Maria. I'm out of patience." She tried to respond, but her voice caught in her throat for a moment. Would he even consider giving me more time? She knew it was a long shot, but there was no alternative. "I just need a few more days," she said softly. "The babies are still recovering from the hospital." "I can't pay it all at once," Maria stammered, gripping the doorframe to steady herself. "I just started working at the hospital where they were admitted. I'm saving up as fast as I can." Her voice shook, but the man facing her only smirked, arms crossed. "I gave you days. I gave you weeks," he sneered. "And what did you do?" "Nothing. Tomorrow, you either have what you owe, or you and those babies will be out on the street. I don't care for excuses anymore," he continued coldly, gesturing dismissively toward the house. "This is already too much for you. No more negotiations, just the money, or you're out. And consider yourself lucky I haven't done worse." Maria's heart sank as the man's threat loomed, his tone carrying a veiled menace. She glanced at her triplets, peacefully asleep, unaware of the storm about to break. I can't let him throw us out. Not like this, she thought, swallowing the fear that threatened to spill into tears. Summoning every ounce of strength, she replied, I'll get the money. Her voice steadied, stronger than she felt. Just one more day, please. I'll make it happen. The man only shook his head, a sarcastic smile on his lips. One more day, he replied. Tomorrow, I'll be here. If there's no money, you're out. With that, he left, his departure leaving a chill in the air. Alone, Maria shut the door, feeling the weight of his words sink in. Desperation gnawed at her as she glanced around the lavish mansion, where she struggled daily just to get by with her kids while he planned an extravagant wedding. With her mind racing, she left the estate, imprinting every detail of its grand decor in her memory. Tomorrow, she reminded herself, her chest tightening, I have to do something before it's too late. The next day, the church was adorned in extravagant splendor. Expensive blooms filled every corner, delicate lights draped from the ceiling, and richly dressed guests filled the pews, eagerly awaiting the ceremony. Everything radiated opulence, just as Cynthia had envisioned. Guests whispered about business deals, social influence, and the prestige of attending one of the most anticipated weddings of the year. Everything seemed flawless. Carl thought as he watched the bustling crowd, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of unease within him. Standing at the altar, dressed to perfection, he felt the weight on his chest grow heavier with each passing second. Why am I feeling this way? This day is supposed to be the most important moment of my life, yet my mind keeps drifting back to Maria. His hands grew damp inside his silk gloves as he remembered their last encounter and the harsh words he'd spoken. Ever since then, something deep inside him had felt off, a gnawing doubt chipping away at his heart. Beside him stood Cynthia, glowing in her custom-designed wedding dress, her smile brimming with a confidence that starkly contrasted Carl's inner turmoil. She seemed mesmerized by the grandiosity of the event, as though everything was precisely as she'd always envisioned. We're finally having the celebration that'll have the whole city talking, she whispered in his ear as the guests settled into their seats. Carl gave a slight nod, though her words felt distant and hollow. Is all she cares about the scale of this event, the price tags? Had she ever thought this moment was truly about us? The question spiraled through his mind, and as he glanced at Cynthia, he began to wonder when their relationship had become more about appearances than genuine feelings. The ceremony started, the soft hum of the organ filling the church, and all eyes focused on the pair at the altar. Carl looked forward, though his mind wandered elsewhere. Why can't I get Maria out of my head? What's become of her? Could this marriage be a mistake? He thought in distress. When the priest began speaking of the commitment marriage requires, the words seemed to resonate with him as though carrying a deeper meaning. Respect, love, and truth are the foundation of marriage, the priest intoned. Respect, love, truth. Carl's mind spun as he realized these values felt absent in his relationship with Cynthia, intensifying his internal struggle. Was he about to tie his life to someone for all the wrong reasons? As the priest continued, talking about the vows each partner must uphold, Carl caught the faint sound of the church doors creaking open. At first, he paid no mind, but murmurs from the guests soon drew his attention, and he turned to see what had caused the stir. Then, as if time itself paused, he saw her, Maria, standing there with 3 small children. She walked down the aisle carrying the triplets, her face pale but resolute, her gaze locked on Carl. The guests' murmurs grew louder, eyes widening as they took in the woman who had entered, a woman whose modest clothes clashed starkly with the grandeur of the ceremony, and who held 3 small children in her arms. No one had expected this intrusion, and for Carl, it felt as though time itself had frozen. What's going on? Who are these children? Why is Maria here? His heart pounded with a mix of emotions. Carl could hardly process what he was seeing. Waves of surprise, guilt, and fear crashed over him, bringing back memories of his past with Maria, memories of the way he'd pushed her out of his life. He was shaken to his core. Cynthia, noticing the rising commotion and spotting Maria at the door, turned to Carl with a confused and irritated expression. "Who is that woman?" she whispered sharply, barely keeping her composure as her frustration showed. "Why is she here?" Carl was silent, lost in his own world, entirely focused on Maria. Each step she took toward the altar felt like an unspoken accusation, a reminder of choices he couldn't undo. He sensed what was coming, but felt completely unprepared to face it. Maria's steps were slow and steady, her arms cradling the triplets, each stride carrying more than just her physical load. Whispers filled the church, a mixture of shock and judgment, remarks about her audacity, about her former role in Carl's life. She noticed them, but let none of it faze her. Her focus remained solely on Carl, determined not to waver. As she finally reached the altar, silence settled over the crowd. Carl felt the weight of their stares, but all that mattered to him were Maria's eyes. Regret sank deeper within him, yet he knew it was too late. "She'll never forgive me," he thought, reading the hardness in her gaze. But those children, could they be? Maria stood directly before him, unyielding. The triplets, peacefully asleep, were oblivious to the storm around them. Holding them securely, she reached for a nearby microphone. Bringing it to her lips, she spoke clearly, her voice steady yet tinged with sorrow. "These are your children, Carl. You left me, but you can't run from what you did. They are yours." The church was filled with whispers, and Carl felt his world collapsing under the weight of Maria's words. Every sentence she spoke felt like a punch, a reminder of every time he dismissed her and acted like she didn't matter. And now here she was, laying her truth bare in front of everyone, right as he stood on the edge of a new marriage. I'm a father. How did this happen? What have I done?" He struggled to keep his mind focused on Maria's words, but panic clouded his thoughts. Maria held the microphone, her voice echoing through the church, unwavering. The crowd, which had been buzzing with tension, fell into a stunned silence. Carl, his face drained of color, couldn't take his eyes off the tiny triplets, fast asleep in Maria's arms. He looked close to breaking down, his mind reeling, scrambling to grasp what was unfolding. How is this real? I'm a father. Why now? Why here? The questions piled up in his mind, yet he could barely find the strength to move. Maria took a steadying breath, fighting the surge of emotions that threatened to engulf her. She had waited so long for this moment, but now, with every eye on her, the pain felt overwhelming. Stay strong. For them, she reminded herself, glancing at the children in her arms. He has to know the truth. Everyone does. "Carl," Maria began, her voice trembling but resolute, "you can try to act like this isn't real. You can try to avoid your responsibility. But these children are yours. They were born too soon. They barely made it. And all of this happened while you were here, planning your wedding like I didn't exist." Each word carried the weight of her pain, cutting deep into Carl's heart. He looked at her, stunned, as if her words were knives slicing into his soul. He remembered that day, how he'd forced her out with such cold words, pushing her away as though she were nothing. What have I done? His mind echoed with his own cruelty. Maria continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I suffered, Carl. I was left alone, raising 3 children. I had to fight for their lives while you lived yours, not giving a second thought to the pain you left me with. You treated me like I was disposable, and I carried that pain alone for far too long. Standing here in front of everyone today, I'm calling on you to finally take responsibility. You once told me I was just a maid, that we could never belong together, and now I see your point. The only thing I ask from you now is to step up for your children and nothing more. We come from different worlds, that much is clear, but I'm glad I'm not like you. I may not have wealth, but I have a good heart. And that, Carl, is worth more than any amount of money. Maria paused, her voice unwavering despite the weight of all she'd endured alone. Cynthia, who had been keeping a stiff demeanor, suddenly lost her composure. Her face twisted in fury and disbelief as she yelled, "What's going on here, Carl?" Her shrill voice echoed through the room, demanding an explanation. "How could you do this to me? How could you humiliate me like this in front of everyone?" She rose from her seat, her anger evident in her trembling hands. Was everything a lie? This marriage? This life we built? Carl opened his mouth but couldn't manage a response, his body frozen under the crushing weight of shame and guilt. He glanced at Cynthia, silently pleading for understanding, though he knew there was nothing he could say to mend what was breaking apart around him. Maria didn't pause. She knew this was the only time she'd have everyone's attention, and she wasn't going to let it slip by. "I have the medical records right here," she said, pulling a folder from her bag. "Here's the proof that you're their father." As she walked toward the altar, holding the folder with resolute determination, the guests remained motionless, captivated by the unfolding scene. Maria handed Carl the folder, which he took with shaking fingers. Inside, he found DNA results, the triplets' medical history, and irrefutable evidence of his paternity, all compiled from a single strand of his hair. Watching Carl hold those documents, Cynthia erupted in rage. "You used me. This whole marriage was a fraud." Her voice, thick with bitterness, redirected the guests' attention to her. Cynthia shook with anger, her piercing gaze locked on Carl, as if he embodied her deepest humiliation. How could I have been so blind, she thought, as her anger hardened into a resolution that could not be swayed. Carl, dazed and unsteady, tried to move closer to Cynthia, but she lifted her hand, halting him before he could say a word. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice sharp and icy. "I'm not the kind of woman who will stand here and allow someone like you to humiliate her in front of everyone." "Cynthia, please, just give me a chance to explain," Carl began, his voice cracking as he searched for the right words, feeling the situation slip further out of his grasp. The truth was out there, raw and undeniable, and he had lost any chance of hiding it. "There's nothing left to explain," Cynthia shouted back. "You've made a mockery of me, parading me through this humiliation, and now you've laid it bare in front of everyone." She glanced around, meeting the curious, judgmental stares of the guests surrounding them. That was all she needed to make her final decision. In one swift motion, she yanked the engagement ring off her finger and dropped it onto the floor with a dismissive glare. "This marriage is over," she declared, her tone unwavering. "I'm not a woman who'll stay beside a man who shatters the life I worked so hard to build." With that, she turned and began walking out, her steps echoing through the church as every eye tracked her resolute departure. No one dared to speak. Carl was frozen, the sound of the ring rolling across the floor, reverberating like the final blow to everything he had once cherished. "I've lost it all," he thought, feeling the weight of his mistakes crush him. "Cynthia, Maria, my children, gone." As he stared at the ring on the ground, the symbol of a bond he knew he could never repair, the atmosphere in the church grew thick and heavy, silence filling the space. Every eye was on Carl, Maria, and the furious Cynthia. Maria still held the microphone, but she now stood like a woman who refused to be demeaned any longer. Not this time, she thought, a steely resolve growing inside her. Carl was immobilized, his eyes locked onto the damning evidence of his hidden life. Cynthia's face twisted with anger as she finally spoke. "Oh, so this is the one you threw our marriage away for," she sneered, her tone dripping with venom. "A maid?" She spat the word out with disdain, as if it were the worst insult imaginable. Her contempt was unmistakable, adding another layer of humiliation to an already shattering moment. Maria drew in a steady breath. She had known all along that Cynthia looked down on her, dismissing her as someone beneath her from the very start. But this time, Maria wasn't backing down. "Yes, I was the maid," she said, her voice unwavering as she held Cynthia's gaze. "I cleaned your house, Carl, every single day. And you know what? I'm proud to be a working woman, someone who shows up and puts in the effort, even if it's in a simple job. Work has worth, or don't. You need people who do it." Maria's words felt like a hard slap to Carl, leaving him momentarily stunned. He thought back to times he'd hidden his embarrassment over being seen with her, just because she was employed in his home. Now, confronted with her words, an intense wave of guilt washed over him. "I was ashamed of the only person who ever showed me real love," he thought, frozen in place. But Cynthia wasn't about to let that go. "Shame on you," she sneered, pointing at Maria with contempt. "You're nothing but a desperate woman, hoping to grab any scrap Carl might throw your way. You showed up here, dragging those kids with you, to ruin the most significant day of my life. That's pathetic." Maria felt her anger rise, but she didn't let it consume her. Instead, she turned Cynthia's own words back on her. "Pathetic, huh?" she replied calmly, yet her words cut like a knife. "I used to stay quiet, let people look down on me. Not anymore. Pathetic is obsessing over status, caring more about money and appearances than about love or respect. You think this wedding is the most important day of your life, but not for the right reasons. You just want what Carl represents: power, money. But you know what's really pathetic, Cynthia? I, the maid, am the only person in this place who's ever loved Carl for who he actually is, not for what he can offer. And I don't even want him anymore. Go ahead with your ceremony. I don't care. All I want is for him to step up and do what's right as a father." The statement hit its mark. Cynthia stood there, speechless for a moment, her face reddening with a mix of anger and humiliation. She opened her mouth to snap back, but Maria's words had struck so deeply that all she could do was glare at Carl with a twisted look of frustration and disgust. Maria didn't hold back. She said, keeping her voice steady, "Someone who has never understood hard work will not disrespect me. By someone who's never had to fight for something real." She turned her gaze from Cynthia to Carl, the intensity in her eyes unmistakable. "I fought for these children's lives, Carl, while you walked away. You were embarrassed because I was just the help. You cared more about what others thought than what you truly felt. And now, look where that's brought us. The two of you are a perfect match." A hush fell over the room as Maria's words sank in. The guests looked on, visibly uncomfortable, murmuring among themselves. Carl, stunned, stood there, still trying to absorb the weight of her words. "I brought this on myself," he thought. Seeing the crowd's shifting focus, Cynthia tried to regain control. "You're just bitter, Maria. You'll end up alone with nothing, while Carl and I still have it all," she shot back. Maria's response was a laugh, one not of joy, but of weariness. "Alone," she echoed. "Cynthia, I've already faced my worst days alone, but I have something you'll never have. I have my children. They're my strength, my heart, and all the love I'll ever need. You can keep the money and the status. In the end, that's all you have." Cynthia snapped, her face red with fury. "This ends here," she screamed, pulling off her engagement ring and flinging it to the floor. The metallic clink echoed in the quiet church. "I'm not marrying a man who humiliates me in public." She cast one last look of disdain at Carl before storming out, the eyes of every guest following her. Carl opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. He just stood there, staring at the ring on the floor, feeling the weight of his choices press down on him. How did I end up here? He wondered, finally recognizing the painful truth in Maria's words. The metallic sound of the ring lingered in his mind, a haunting reminder of all. He had lost. The church was now a quiet shell, only faint whispers from the guests lingering in the air, almost too soft for him to even register. How did things go this wrong, he wondered, feeling the crushing weight of everything he'd lost. Cynthia, Maria, his children. Maria's final words still constricted his chest, and for the first time, he began to comprehend just how deep his mistakes ran. Without saying a word, Carl made his way toward the church doors, signaling Maria to follow. He could feel the cold, judgmental stares of the guests as he passed. Stepping outside, the cool night breeze hit his face, but it did nothing to calm the storm in his mind. Maria, meanwhile, radiated an unwavering resolve. As Carl approached, her body went tense, and the bitterness she thought she'd suppressed rose sharply to the surface. He stopped just a few feet from her, his eyes weary and full of regret. Is he going to try apologizing? Maria wondered, holding her children close. Does he really think a few empty words can undo it all? "Maria," he began, his voice barely audible, I don't even know where to start." He searched her eyes, hoping to find a trace of understanding, but only met the coldness he'd sown. "I did everything wrong. I hurt you. I hurt them. I don't even know what I was thinking." Maria cut him off sharply. "Carl, there's nothing you can say that'll change what you did. You walked away and treated me like I was worthless. And now, just because I interrupted your perfect life, you want to set things right?" Her voice shook with raw hurt, and Carl could feel how deep her wounds ran. He thinks everything can be fixed with a quick apology, she thought, fighting back the resentment welling up in her chest. "Maria, please," Carl whispered, stepping closer. "I don't want you to think it's just that. I know I can't erase what I did, but I need to try. I want to be part of my kids' lives. I want to make up for what I did to you and to them. I messed up, but I can change that now. Let me help. Let me be their father." Maria laughed, but there was no warmth in it, only sorrow. "Carl, you have no idea what I went through. I was left with nowhere to go, scrambling for a place to live while pregnant. But I'm not like you. I don't judge people or close my heart. You'll have every right to see your children, but nothing more than that." Carl bowed his head, the weight of Maria's words sinking in, hitting him with a truth he'd tried to avoid. She's right. I've been so wrapped up in myself, he thought, shame starting to build up inside him. I know I don't deserve to be forgiven, Maria. I know I messed up completely, but I swear I want to change. I want to be there for the triplets, to do what's best for them, he said, causing Maria's tense expression to soften just slightly. You'll be in their lives, not mine. Got it? If you dare hurt them, or push any of your twisted values on my kids, you'll understand the pain you've put me through, she warned, her tone fierce and protective, before turning to leave. her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Later that day, Maria sat on the living room floor, surrounded by the triplets' clothes and toys, suitcases scattered around. Her gaze was fixed on a bare spot on the wall as she folded a tiny blanket, trying to keep her hands busy and block out the storm of emotions churning inside. I was so harsh. I didn't even give him a chance to help or explain, she thought, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The thought of being forced out, left with nowhere to go with her kids, sent a shiver through her. But she knew she couldn't go back. I can't trust him, she muttered, trying to soothe her aching heart with resolve. Suddenly, the sound of the doorbell cut through her thoughts. She froze for a second, her pulse spiking. It's probably the landlord. He's here to kick us out, she thought, tears slipping down her cheeks. The idea of being thrown out, with her children still so young, felt like the ground was vanishing from beneath her feet. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks as she wiped her face with the sleeve of her shirt. I was foolish. I should have demanded the child support he never paid. I can't rely on him for anything, she thought, her face damp with tears. With hesitant steps, Maria walked toward the door, each heartbeat pounding in her ears. She braced herself for the worst. But when she opened the door, she was met with Mrs. Martha's gentle smile and tender gaze. "Maria," Mrs. Martha began, her voice warm yet resolute. "May I come in?" Mrs. Martha's gentle voice broke the silence. Maria nodded, unable to say a word, her throat tight with emotion. Mrs. Martha stepped into the room, taking in the scattered luggage, the little ones with sleepy eyes, and Maria's worn, weary expression. Just one look told her everything she needed to know. She's been carrying too much on her own. The thought stirred something deep in Mrs. Martha, who softened her tone as she sat down, patting the seat next to her for Maria. "I know it's been rough for you, dear," she began quietly. "It feels like you're facing this all by yourself. But that's not true. I won't let you go through this on your own." Her calm, soothing words seemed to ease the tension in the room. Maria tried to speak, but found her voice stuck. Instead, she reached for Mrs. Martha's hand, tears silently streaming down her face. "I can't keep going," she thought, feeling the pent-up exhaustion she'd been fighting so long. Mrs. Martha held Maria's hand tighter. "You've been strong for so long," she continued, her voice warm and full of compassion. "It's a heavy burden to raise 3 children by yourself when someone should have stood by you. But you did it. You made sure they were safe, fed, clothed, and loved. That's a powerful thing, and no one can take that from you." Maria took a shaky breath, her tears subsiding as Mrs. Martha's words sank in. "She's right. I did what I could. But was it enough?" Doubts tugged at her, but Mrs. Martha's steady gaze was filled with understanding and encouragement. "You fought for them, and that's what matters," Mrs. Martha assured her, "and you don't have to fight alone anymore. I know the bills, the rent, everything feels overwhelming, but I'm here now, and we'll face this together. You and the kids aren't alone." Maria looked up, surprised and relieved, as a glimmer of hope took root in her heart. "Mrs. Martha, I'm at a loss for words. You've already done so much for me. I can't possibly accept more," Maria said, her voice trembling as she tried to hold back her tears. Mrs. Martha interrupted her gently, a warm smile on her face. Now, don't say that, dear. I'm not giving you anything you haven't already earned. You've worked tirelessly, giving everything you have to keep those little ones safe and well. What I'm offering is a bit of relief, a chance for some peace. Bring yourself and the triplets to stay with me. I've got more than enough space, and honestly, having you all there would bring me so much joy." Maria's eyes widened with surprise. "Live with you? I don't want to intrude. You've already been so generous," she said, uncertainty in her voice. "You wouldn't be intruding, Maria," Mrs. Martha replied, her tone steady yet warm. "You're worthy of this support, and your children deserve a stable place to grow up without you carrying this heavy burden alone. I saw all you went through. You fought hard, and now it's time for someone to stand by you. Everyone needs help sometime, and right now that's you. I'm not taking no for an answer." Maria looked down, overwhelmed by Mrs. Martha's kindness, but still wrestling with the idea of depending on someone else. "I don't know how to thank you. I was so lost, thinking today was the day we'd be evicted. I didn't even consider any other options. I'm not sure I can accept this, Mrs. Martha. I've always been self-reliant, always found a way to make things work on my own." With a reassuring smile, Mrs. Martha placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Being self-reliant doesn't mean you have to bear everything on your own, dear. Sometimes the greatest strength we show is when we accept the help that's offered. Your children need you strong and healthy, and to be that, you need rest and support. I can see how much you've already sacrificed. Now, let someone else step in to help you." Maria looked over at the triplets who slept soundly on the couch, blissfully unaware of the storm in her heart. She knew Mrs. Martha was right, but the thought of accepting help was still daunting. "But what if I fail again?" she thought, hesitation still lingering. "Maria," Mrs. Martha said softly, yet with a strength in her voice that was unshakable, "from the day I met you, I've seen how resilient you are. I watched a woman who kept pushing forward, even when the odds were stacked against her. I understand that accepting help can feel uncomfortable, but please know it's not a weakness. It means you're prioritizing what's best for your kids, and that's what makes you an incredible mom." Maria finally allowed herself to cry openly, but this time, her tears weren't from despair. They were from relief. "Thank you. I don't even know how to express my gratitude," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. Mrs. Martha rose, enveloping Maria in a gentle hug. "You'll make it through this, my dear. You're much stronger than you realize, and I'll be right here with you and your children to ensure it." Carl faced days of unimaginable fallout after his public disgrace. The broken marriage, the revelation about the children he had abandoned, and the looks of disgust from friends and strangers weighed heavily on him. But the true reckoning came when his father walked into the mansion's living room one last time. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Carl's father, usually a composed and authoritative figure, was visibly seething. His steps were deliberate, his gaze fierce with disappointment. Carl sensed the gravity of the situation. "This is it. He's really going to make me pay," he thought, bracing himself for what lay ahead. "Carl," his father said, in a dangerously calm tone, "what you've done is unforgivable. I did not raise a man who wrecks lives and then carries on as though nothing happened. You failed in your duties as a son, a father, and a human being. I saw it all at the wedding, and it pains me to admit you are my son." Carl bowed his head, feeling the weight of each word. He tried to speak, but his father silenced him with a stern gesture. "I don't want to hear any excuses. Words mean nothing now." His father's voice grew colder with each phrase. "As of today, you have no claim to anything. You've lost the mansion, the business, the inheritance. You'll start fresh and hopefully learn to appreciate what you never valued before." Carl's eyes widened in disbelief, his face a mix of shock and fear. "What? Dad, you can't do this. I'm your son. Yes, I've messed up, but taking everything from me, that's too harsh." "Harsh?" His father let out a bitter chuckle. "Harsh is what you did to Maria, a woman who cared for you, yet you threw her out without a second thought. Harsh is how you treated your own kids, like they were just nuisances to you. No, Carl, I'm just giving you a chance to see life from the perspective of the people you've always looked down on." Carl tried to argue, feeling trapped. "Dad, I'll pay child support. I'll do whatever I need to. But please don't take everything. How am I supposed to survive with no home, no job?" His father's expression didn't soften. "You'll find out. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working at the company, not as the boss, but as a janitor. You'll be doing the work Maria did for years, the work you never appreciated. You'll clean floors, tidy up rooms, and you'll see what it's like to be treated as less than, just like you treated others." Carl felt his heart drop, a cold dread settling over him. A janitor? Me? "Dad, come on. This will crush what little dignity I have left." He pleaded, his voice heavy with despair, but his father was unmoved. "This is the only way for you to learn to appreciate what you've taken for granted all your life. You'll be the one scrubbing floors, just like you used to have others do for you. Maybe then, Carl, you'll finally understand what it means to be human." The next morning, Carl arrived at the company without his usual suit and self-assured attitude. He wore a janitor's uniform, his name stitched plainly on the shirt, a constant reminder of his new place in the world. Pushing a cleaning cart through the halls, he felt the curious or disdainful stares of former colleagues and employees. Each sweep of the broom chipped away at his pride, each step a fresh lesson in humility. The employees' voices were muted, but Carl could still sense the mockery in their laughter, directed at his downfall. So, this was the once mighty Carl, huh? Look at him now. One of them didn't even bother to hide his comment. "I earned this. It's what I did to Maria," Carl thought, as he pushed the mop across the cold, hard floor. During lunch, Carl found himself alone in the cramped, stifling staff room, a place he had never even noticed before. He could sense the whispers and the judgmental glances thrown his way. This must have been how Maria felt every day. "I never cared, and now it's my turn." The days dragged on, each one feeling longer and more bitter than the last. Whenever he stepped into a conference room to clean, memories surfaced of when he used to command those meetings. Now, as he scrubbed the floors, his reflection revealed a man stripped of everything he once held dear because of his own arrogance. "Will I ever come back from this?" he wondered, scrubbing harder to push away the feeling of despair. When his shift ended, Carl found himself alone in the massive company building he once called his own. Sitting in the cramped janitor's closet, he replayed the events that had led him here. The hard physical work took a toll, but the mental strain weighed far heavier. I was the boss, and now I'm just the janitor. "How did it come to this?" he muttered, his voice echoing in the empty silence around him. But deep down, Carl recognized this was just the beginning of the lesson he needed to learn. The privileges, the protection that came with power and wealth, all of it was gone. Now, he faced the same disdain he once dished out to Maria, but directed at himself. The shame was relentless, and he understood the path to any kind of redemption would be long, if it existed at all. The days felt like an endless punishment, each one beginning with him putting on the janitor's uniform and enduring the smirks and murmurs of former colleagues. "I did this to myself," he thought, polishing the spotless floors of what was once his domain. Yet, buried beneath the daily humiliation, one thought gnawed at him more than anything: Maria. Since the day everything fell apart, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about her and the triplets. What happened to her? Is she okay? Are the babies safe? The questions haunted him, and the guilt dug deep into his soul. Carl knew he'd let Maria down, but now the urge to see her, to try to make things right, grew stronger each day. One quiet afternoon at work, as he was tidying up an empty meeting room, he made up his mind. "I have to see her. I have to talk to Maria." He dropped the mop, pulled out his phone, and tried calling her several times, each attempt leaving his heart pounding harder. But every call went unanswered. She doesn't want to hear from me, he thought, a tightness forming in his throat. But I need to find her. I need to see my kids. Not sure where else to look, Carl decided to try Maria's last known address, where she'd been living alone with the triplets until she was forced out for falling behind on rent. He walked the streets, feeling the weight of each step as he thought back on his mistakes. I left her alone with 3 kids to raise. What kind of man does that? When he arrived at the small building Maria had called home, he climbed the steps, his heart racing. He knocked, but there was only silence. He tried again, but no answer came. The place looked abandoned, as if no one had been there in weeks. She's gone, he realized, his panic rising. Where could she have gone? People don't just vanish. He asked around, and only one elderly neighbor had anything to offer. She recalled seeing Maria leave with her children and some luggage a few weeks ago. Maybe she found somewhere new, the neighbor said. Could she still close by? The words didn't ease Carl's worry. Instead, they only heightened his dread. I have to find her, he whispered to himself as he walked down the steps, his mind racing. What if she went far away? What if she doesn't want me around at all? The thoughts tormented him, the reality of losing her and his kids weighing heavily on him. Standing on the sidewalk, he gazed out, feeling the full weight of his choices pressing down on him. Meanwhile, at Lady Martha's home, the days were growing gentler for Maria. Although she carried scars from past struggles, the warm atmosphere, Martha's kindness, and the triplets' laughter were slowly sparking a new hope within her. One peaceful afternoon, while the kids were napping, Maria decided to do something she hadn't done in ages: bake a cake. Moving into her new place, she had pushed away simple joys like this, but now it felt like the perfect way to break free from the stress still lingering in her life. As she worked in the cozy kitchen, the sweet, comforting scent of vanilla filled the air, bringing back memories of simpler times when her biggest worries seemed so much smaller. Martha entered the kitchen after the cake had finished baking and had come out of the oven golden and just right. "Oh my goodness, Maria, this looks amazing," Martha said, smiling. "You never mentioned you were such a great baker." Maria chuckled softly. "It's something I used to love doing before, but with everything that happened, I never thought about getting back into it." Martha took a piece, and as she tasted it, her eyes lit up with surprise. "Maria, this is incredible. You really have a gift," Martha praised, her eyes sparking with a new idea. "You know, honey, you should think about starting a bakery." Maria blinked, startled by the suggestion. A bakery of her own. After all she had been through, the thought of starting something brand new felt distant, almost unreal. Could I really do it? She wondered aloud, still uncertain. "I don't know, Martha. Opening a business is a big commitment." "Yes, it's a big step," Martha said, meeting her gaze. "But look at all you've been through. You've overcome so much, Maria. Now's the time to build something for yourself and your kids. This cake is just the beginning. I truly believe if you go for this, you'll do amazing." Martha placed a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder, encouraging her. "You have the talent and the courage. All you're missing is believing in yourself." Martha's words stayed with Maria for days, echoing in her mind. Maybe I really can do this, she thought, starting to imagine the possibilities of opening her own bakery. With Martha's constant support and brainstorming sessions, Maria soon began experimenting with new recipes and selling her first cakes. Success came quickly, and before she knew it, she was swamped with orders. As the months rolled by, Maria's little business blossomed beyond what she had ever imagined. Orders for cakes, pies, and pastries kept rolling in, and she often found herself marveling. I never dreamed I'd be here. As she quietly put together the wedding cake, Maria couldn't help but talk to herself, lost in thought. That afternoon, a new order came in. This one was for a delivery near Carl's workplace. Her stomach tightened for a second when she heard where it was, but she reminded herself that turning down orders wasn't an option. I'm stronger now, she reassured herself. I can handle this. Once everything was set, she packed up the cake and headed to the address. As she neared the building, her heart began to race. Equal parts, nerves and curiosity. She hadn't seen Carl since the divorce, and she wasn't sure what she'd find. But as she came closer, something made her stop. Across the street, she spotted someone familiar. There was Carl, dressed in a janitor's uniform, sweeping the sidewalk. Shock washed over her. He's out here cleaning the sidewalk of his own building, she thought, astonished. Seeing him like this, a complete contrast to the man she once knew, was jarring. For a moment, she considered just walking past, but something held her there. Carl, noticing her, immediately dropped the broom and rushed over. "Maria, please hear me out," he pleaded, visibly shaken, his eyes filled with a raw humiliation. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need to ask for forgiveness. I understand now, truly, what you went through. I realize how much pain I caused." Maria held back, watching him with a calm but resolute expression. Gone was the man who had dismissed her so easily. Instead, here was someone vulnerable, worn down by his own regrets. "Do you really understand, Carl?" Her voice was steady. "Do you get what it felt like to be tossed aside, like I was nothing? To raise 3 kids alone, struggling to provide, while you lived without a care?" Carl's head dropped, shame evident. "Yes, Maria. Now I understand," he admitted. "Everything I've been through has shown me just how selfish I was. I know I hurt you in ways I never should have. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but please, let me be a part of our children's lives. They deserve to have a father, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to be that for them." Maria took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and weight lift from her chest. Finally, he gets it, she thought, sensing a shift within herself. Looking Carl straight in the eye, she said, "I won't sugarcoat it, Carl. What you did shattered me, and I'll never erase that. But I see you've made changes, and because of that, I'm choosing to forgive you." Carl lifted his head, his eyes filled with raw emotion. You forgive me?" he stammered, disbelief coloring his voice. "I forgive you, Carl," Maria replied with conviction. "But that doesn't mean we're getting back together. Forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation. We're each on our own journey now. For the kids, though, I'll let you be part of their lives, as long as you keep showing up the right way." Carl nodded, visibly moved, the gratitude evident on his face. "I promise, Maria," he said earnestly. "I promise I'll be the father they deserve." With one last glance, Maria turned toward her car, feeling like a chapter of her life had finally come to a close. Carl watched her walk away, realizing that while their relationship would never be the same, he had another chance to be there for his kids. The months that followed saw Carl rebuilding his life. Humbled and grounded, he dedicated himself not just to his work, but more importantly, to being present for the triplets. Day by day, Carl became more involved, committing himself in ways he hadn't before, cherishing each moment with them. His connection with Maria grew into a respectful, cooperative partnership. Together, they found a rhythm that kept the past behind them and centered their focus on the children. The triplets' laughter was a constant in every room they entered, and both Carl and Maria were devoted to giving them a stable, loving home. As Carl continued proving himself at work through humility and hard work, his father, who'd once taken away his privileges, began noticing his genuine transformation. Several months after Carl had been demoted to a janitorial role, his father finally invited him in for a talk. "I've been watching you work hard, Carl," his father said, his tone sincere. "You've learned to appreciate what it truly means to work and to value those around you. Because of that, I'm offering you a second chance with the company." Carl was taken aback, deeply grateful for this renewed opportunity. "I've learned, Dad. Now I know what it's like to be responsible for more than just myself," he said humbly, a sense of maturity evident in his tone from the past few months. His father gave a small, approving smile. "You'll start fresh in administration, but you've got to earn your place. This company's foundation is hard work, not privilege. I hope you get it right this time." With this new position, Carl threw himself into rebuilding, though this time his perspective had shifted. He saw work not just as a path to personal success, but as a way to make a positive impact. He kept his days structured, but now he prioritized being there for the triplets, ensuring they felt loved and cherished. He took them to school, to the park, and taught them the values of kindness and respect. Meanwhile, Maria continued to flourish with her bakery. Her small business was booming. Now, with 2 locations, she could hardly keep up with demand. But the fulfillment was undeniable. She had created a life of purpose through her own hard work. Every time she looked at the triplets, she was reminded that every bit of it was worthwhile. And, as Maria grew her business, Mrs. Martha remained a constant support in her life, a second mother and a devoted grandmother to the triplets, always around for childcare and wise counsel. Martha had been a steady anchor for Maria through her hardest days. One peaceful afternoon, as they worked together in the bakery's kitchen, Martha watched Maria put the finishing touches on a custom cake for a big event. Maria's skill always amazed her, but what moved her most was seeing how far Maria had come. "I told you, sweetheart," Martha said, her face glowing with pride. "You made it. Look at all you've created." "It's all from your hard work, your heart," Martha continued. Maria's eyes welled up with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Martha. From the start, you believed in me, even when I didn't. You gave me a home, support, and stayed by my side through everything. I'm forever grateful." Martha, with the wisdom of her years, smiled gently. "Life's like a circle, my dear. What you've done is from your own efforts. I just did what anyone should. Lend a hand to those in need. And now, look at the incredible woman you've become. Your children look up to you, and everyone who knows you sees the resilient, determined woman you've become." Maria brushed away a tear, feeling moved. "I always promised myself I'd find a way to repay you for everything." "You already have," Martha replied, resting her hand on Maria's. "You filled my home with joy, and together we became a family. You gave your children something rare, a home filled with love, and now you're spreading happiness to others with your treats." The triplets, always darting around the shop, were like little beams of light brightening every corner. They adored Martha, who loved taking them on strolls and sharing bedtime stories. To Martha, seeing Maria and her children happy was a gift in itself. Then one day, a new cake order came in. Maria had to deliver it to an event near Carl's company. Feeling a mix of hesitation and resolve to move forward, she accepted the job. On delivery day, as she parked nearby, something made her freeze. She stepped out, taking in the scene before her. There was Carl, once full of arrogance and pride, now working a humble job. He looked so different. Noticing her, he walked over with a tentative smile. "Maria," he said, looking surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." She returned his smile, emotions swirling within her. "I have a delivery nearby," she said. "You look different." Carl nodded, his eyes reflecting a new understanding. "I am different. After everything I've learned a lot. All I want now is to be a good father and live honestly." Maria saw the honesty in his gaze. "You are a good father, Carl. The boys love you, and I can see you've changed. I'm glad to see it," she replied. They stood quietly, sharing a moment without the need for words. Carl asked for nothing more. No excuses were made, just a quiet acceptance of the lives they were building. Later that evening, Maria sat with Martha and reflected on how much had changed. "He finally understands," she said thoughtfully. "And that's all that truly matters, dear," Martha replied, with a smile. The journey to understanding was a long one, but the most important thing was that he arrived. Over time, life adjusted to a new normal. Maria continued growing her bakery, Martha stayed close by her side, and Carl remained a devoted father. Despite the fact that their romance would never blossom again, they managed to coexist peacefully because of their shared love for their children. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm hues of orange and pink, the triplets played freely in the backyard, their laughter filling the air like sweet little melodies. The soft grass underfoot and the gentle breeze on their faces made for a simple yet meaningful moment for Carl and Maria, who watched from afar. For both parents, witnessing their children's carefree play, unburdened by life's troubles, was the greatest gift after all they'd endured. Maria, settled in a rocking chair on Martha's porch, felt a peace she hadn't known in years. With a serene smile, she watched the boys, her thoughts drifting between memories of the past and contentment in the present. "We did it," she thought, rocking slowly, the chair's rhythm a soft backdrop to her children's laughter. "Against all odds, despite the pain and humiliation, I gave them the life they deserved." She knew her journey had been tough, filled with obstacles, tears, and countless sleepless nights caring for her boys, but every hardship had been worth it. It had been challenging but necessary, and she felt at peace with her choices. Maria was no longer the woman who'd been humiliated and abandoned. She was a strong mother, a thriving businesswoman who'd rebuilt her life for herself and her children. Across the yard, Carl watched his sons as they ran, their laughter filling a void he'd long carried. With a more grounded perspective, he saw the value in these quiet, everyday moments. Gone was the man who once cared only about status and wealth. He'd learned, through humility and hardship, that the true value of life lay in simplicity. It was in the unconditional love his children held for him and the respect he had finally earned back from Maria. Carl couldn't believe how much he'd overlooked, realizing the choices that had led him down such a challenging path. Now, as he looked at his triplets' bright, cheerful faces, he finally grasped the real lesson of his journey. "It doesn't matter what I lost," he whispered to himself, feeling tears form, "but what I've found." His heart was no longer weighed down by regrets, but filled with gratitude. A second chance to be a better father and to play a real part in his children's lives. Maria's faith in him had given him the strength to keep moving forward. From across the yard, they exchanged a glance, not as lovers, but as parents who'd come to a place of mutual respect, understanding, and peace for the sake of their kids. Martha, observing quietly from the window, smiled to herself. Things turned out all right in the end, she thought, satisfied. She knew that Carl and Maria still had plenty of learning to do, but the path they were now on was lighter, more hopeful than the one they'd left behind. She'd helped Maria through the darkest days, and seeing the harmony between them now, Martha was sure that the future looked promising, for everyone involved. As the sky transitioned into evening and the first stars began to appear, the children, full of joy, ran around the yard, blissfully unaware of the struggles that had shaped the lives around them. For Maria and Carl, there was no longer a need to dwell on the past. The scars would always be there, yes, but they were reminders of how far they had come and how much they'd grown. Together, they had endured, evolved, and most importantly, each found a place of peace within themselves. As the day came to a close and stars began to fill the night sky, Maria took one last look at the triplets before calling them inside for dinner. They're safe and happy. That's what counts now, she thought, content with the life she'd rebuilt for her family. If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support encourages us to bring inspiring stories to you every day. Don't miss out on the next heartwarming narrative we have in store. We're grateful to have you with us. Now, you can click the links appearing on your screen. We've selected a collection just for you, filled with valuable stories and endless entertainment. See you there.